Rabbi Saroken, how are you?
Rabbi Schwartz, happy post-Thanksgiving.
Happy post-Thanksgiving. Welcome back from Israel.
Thank you.
It's great. I'm glad you're able to go.
Yeah.
Spend some time with Noah. Noah's good.
Yeah, she's so good. Living her best life in the war zone.
There you go.
I know.
There you go. Hopefully less and less of a war zone. We can hope with
Yeah.
good tidings in terms of ceasefires and such things. Hope they continue. So, what do we
Vayetze.
Vayetze.
Yeah, we're
Wow.
in the love stories.
Wow.
So last week we had Toldot, so we had the story of Jacob and Esav and the sort of bait and switch. We had the sort of moment where Jacob took from Esav, or Esav gave to Jacob the birthright, and then later on they took the blessing. And now this week Jacob is on the run. So he's on the run from
Right.
Beersheba,
Right.
and he's heading toward the well, but he stops to sleep for the night, and that's where he experiences God.
Famous story. Famous story. Yeah.
Can I tell you the funniest thing really fast?
Yeah.
So last week we're on the phone talking about Israel and Noah. So we're on the phone, Gideon, Noah, and I on like one of these group calls. And Noah says to us with like great pride, she goes, "Mom, Giddy," she's like, "I had maybe for the first time in my life this experience where like I felt God's presence to the degree that like I wanted to like run to shul and pray." And I was like, wow, that's not like a typical Noah statement. So I said, "No," I'm like, "Where were you? What was happening?" She goes, "The Inbal Hotel has soup week." And she goes, there are like 7 silver canisters of all different kinds of soups with delicious breads on the end. She goes, "I felt overwhelmed by my sense of godliness in that moment."
Right. God was in this place.
Yeah,
of,
and she didn't
Israel
know
Yadati.
it.
I didn't
Exactly.
know. I didn't know. That's Jacob's experience.
It really is.
That's Jacob's. Yeah. So what's your take on Vayetze?
So it's an interesting thing. I feel like there are sort of parts to it. Like first is this moment where Jacob goes and he puts his head down, and then he feels God's presence, and in some ways sort of gives a somewhat conditional bargain with God.
sure.
Saying, "If you're with me and if you clothe me and give me food to eat and all of these things, then we're good." And then you see, sort of like Noah in a totally different circumstance, sort of saying like, "Wow, God is in this place and I didn't know it," when he wakes up. And then we see him journey on. And it's there that he goes to the well and he meets Rachel. And we see him doing sort of this beautiful act of chesed. When she arrives, he sort of unstops the water and gives water to her animals. And then we see him basically, kiss her and get really overwhelmed.
Right.
And then sort of make this connection of like, "Oh, I am, by the way, your relative." And so it's sort of a 2-part, I think.
And then you got to get into the whole business of working all the years and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's also, it's an interesting thing, the working all the years, because I think it's like one of the most romantic exchanges in the Torah, or at least like passage in the Torah, where he says, he was willing to work for Lavan, his father-in-law, for all of those years, and those 7 years felt like a day,
Right.
because of his love for Rachel.
Right. Yeah, it's a beautiful passage. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's also Jacob. To me, is such a complicated character. And you used a moment ago. We're talking about the end of Toldot with the I would argue intentional deception of Isaac, where Rebecca is complicit in that as well, and Jacob is perfectly willing to go along with the ride. Has opportunities to, Isaac asks him twice, "Who are you?" Both times he lies. So he's a very complicated character, and there's this incredible verse in this week's Parsha where, Jacob realizes that the switcheroo has been pulled, right? And he's married Leah and not Rachel, and And he goes to Laban and he says, hey, what did you do? And Laban's response is unbelievable. Laban says, oh, no. We don't do it in this place to marry the younger before the older.
Right.
You know, it's such an accusatory. It's sort of like Laban saying, I know what you did. I know what you did.
Huh.
And we're not doing it that way here. And it's such a midah keneged midah.
Right,
you know,
right.
Kind of measure for measure sort of punishment. Although in the end, it's also interesting that Leah, in a lot of ways, is like the steadying force in the family. In some ways. I think that's a whole nother conversation.
You know, it's interesting the way that you're understanding Lavan, almost as someone who's like meting out justice in a way, or at least some sort of consequence for something that was like unsettled, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because I actually think that Lavan is, I think he is like, he's very familiar to Jacob, and Jacob is very familiar to Lavan because they sort of share this tendency, right? So like when Jacob wakes up and he sees that he's married Leah, not Rachel, and he like, you know, you sort of like imagine him like, you know, throwing off the covers and like storming out of the room and saying like, what have you done? And Lavan is sort of like, like it's not our custom here, right? To marry off the younger before the older. But then, you know, the Midrash comes and colors it a bit and says like you're calling me a trickster, you know, says Lavan to Jacob, like you of all people.
Exactly.
And I feel like it's a really interesting moment. There's a part of me that feels like Rachel and Leah are like surrounded by, you know.
Well, there's a lot of parallelism there, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, Jacob deceives Isaac by pretending to be someone else.
Yes.
And then he is
Deceived
by
for
someone pretending to be someone else. There's like a lot of parallelism. Gail and I just watched this show. It was on, I think it was on Apple TV, and it was called Disclaimer.
Huh.
Jeremy, did you see it? No. Jeremy's behind the glass, folks. Jeremy behind the glass. And it's worth checking out. It's kind of a disturbing show. I think it was 7 episodes. It's kind of like a psychodrama type thing. But like classic Shakespeare did this all the time. There are 2 families, but the families are parallel one to the other. You know, there's loss in both families. Both families have a son. Both families have a cat. And it's clearly intentional. Because you can, by showing something in one, you're indicating that it's going on in the other without having to show it, right?
Right.
It kind of works like that. And Tanakh was familiar with that. You know, Torah was familiar with that sort of literary structure and using it. I think it's very provocative. But I struggle with Jacob. I really struggle with Jacob.
You know, it's curious. I was thinking about Jacob a bit this week as we sat down for Thanksgiving in Israel, which is sort of a fun experience because it's not a part of Israel's culture.
What do they serve for Thanksgiving in Israel? Schnitzel?
Well, you know, it's funny if you think about it, though. Hodu, right, turkey, is also, you know, gratitude or thanks, which is a really funny thing. So we were able to have turkey twice, but we went to our friend Elliot and Rebecca's house, and they asked us to bring from America cranberries. So that was our, like, every time we stopped, I was like, Ralph, don't forget the cranberries. They were, like, going in and out. But so I was thinking about Jacob just in terms of, like, you know, Thanksgiving and gratitude. And I was thinking that actually it's funny, but Jacob has so much, he accomplishes so much in his life. He has so much success in his life, whether whether it's sort of working on Lavan's farm or later on, he has a huge family. He has, material wealth. He has, status. He really, he's quite a remarkable life. And yet at the end of his life, when he goes and he meets, his son's boss, Joseph's boss, Pharaoh, he says, how old are you? And he says, few and terrible have been the days of my life. It's a funny thing, just sort of that question of like, how we're seeing Jacob's life and then how he sees his life.
Yeah, for sure. No, I gave a sermon on that actually at the time. I remember precisely, like that was the whole point.
Yeah.
You look at yourself. People might look at you and see whatever X, Y, or Z. But then the way you see yourself, consider yourself, understand your life, can be completely different. and he remembers the bitterness. Really, in
Yeah.
the end, is what he's kind of caught up in that. He remembers the bitterness.
What do you struggle with Jacob?
You know, I think he's just the kind of pshat of the character, right? The plain meaning of it is that he's deceptive. You know, he I don't think he does well by his children, particularly. You know, he creates the whole Joseph brother tension issue, like all of that.
Dina.
You know, he just there's very little to me when you're reading through again the plain stories, like what actually happened. There's not a lot of redeemable material that I see there. And it's just an interesting, you know, again we see it in the Torah over and over again, where these characters that are complicated, challenged, morally compromised frequently, and the Torah tells their story straight. You know, doesn't feel a need to hide it, cover it up, just tell it straight. And these are our people.
You know, it's interesting what you said about Jacob and sort of, you know, his character, because I wonder if you couldn't find something a little bit redeeming in knowing that he actually ended up working, you know, 7 plus 7 plus 7 plus I think 1, right? So 21 or 22 years to marry Rachel, you know, well, to think he was marrying Rachel, to only be marrying Leah,
Right.
then another 7 years to marry Rachel, plus another 7 years for his father-in-law. Like, I feel like in some way there's some redemptive character moment in that hard work.
I could see why you would argue that. Yeah.
And then after that, you know, he was sort of just getting fed up with Lavan at that point. But he was very generous even when he sort of was on his way out the door. Remember, he said, like, I'll take the crappy animals. Like, I don't need the best
but he
of.
manipulates that too, remember? He manipulates that with that weird story about the wood and the changing the spots and all that kind of stuff. So, no, I listen, he's clearly, you know, he's very bright, you know, he figures things out. He's able to get what he needs when he needs to get it. I mean, all that kind of stuff. He's certainly got a lot of sort of high achiever qualities.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. I just think he's morally, I struggle with a lot of the choices that he makes and the way he deceives people and all that thing. And part of it is, you know, it's the old question, like if someone, you know, if someone does something bad to you, is it okay then for you to do something bad back to them or not? You know, and a lot of people would say, yeah, they deserve it. They did. And my tendency is to say, no, just because someone else's behavior is poor doesn't excuse your behavior. It's easy to say, hard to do. It's easy to say, hard
And where do you see Jacob as doing that? At which part of his story do you feel like he's...
Oh, I think, you know, sort of like with Lavan, like Lavan has tricked him, and now he's tricking Lavan back with the sheep and all that kind of stuff. But I do think so. But here's sort of my kind of caveat space for Jacob, which is I also always see his character as the character of someone who grows up in the shadow of this terribly traumatic event, you know. And to me, it's like we know, and there's research coming out about this now about people who grow up in the homes of Holocaust survivors.
Yeah.
Right, and what a struggle that is, and the pain in that house, never spoken, right, but always present, like always felt, and how challenging it is for the parents, the people who survived the Shoah, but then their children, and sometimes even their grandchildren. So here's Jacob, and he's the son of basically a survivor of this trauma, which is the almost sacrifice of Isaac. So I see that as part of a piece of his character that maybe lends more nuance to the decisions that he makes. It's all that kind of stuff.
You know, it's so interesting when you look at that sort of, you know, what today people would say is intergenerational trauma. Right?
Exactly.
It's interesting, though, because Asaph, who also grows up in the house, you know, you see a little bit of acting out in terms of the choice of a woman that he marries, but by and large, you also you see Asaph in a way that I don't know, his actions feel almost almost lovely in
Yeah.
comparison, right?
Yeah.
Like very
Yeah.
generous, very thoughtful, especially when they, no spoiler alert, but when they eventually come back together, you sort of, you're rooting for Esav a little bit too, that he should, at least the script should be flipped and the vilification should sort of calm down for him.
100%.
You see some redeeming moments there too,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, Esau, I think, is, like you just say, the rabbinic tradition really vilifies. I mean, it's unbelievable. And meanwhile, what do you do? Like, he didn't do anything.
Yeah.
He seems to be like a decent guy, and it is interesting. But part of it also maybe is that, so who, at the end of the day, who has to bear the burden of trying to carry the covenant forward?
Yeah.
And it's Jacob.
Jacob.
Esau can go free from that. It's not his thing. He doesn't have to worry about it, and it's a serious burden.
Yeah. Last night I was reading an old issue of The Atlantic. Sometimes it's fun to go back in time and to see, what was being written in the media and like what did we miss and what did we pay attention to or what would we pay attention to differently. And it was an article about sort of these dictionaries that are appearing in the world around us right now. The Sierra Club has one, and a whole bunch of other companies and organizations have them that they're putting out, which is about words that we can use now and words that you can't use. And it's been an interesting thing as I read through them to sort of say, like, who gets to determine that, and who gets to figure out what's on a list of, like, you can't say that anymore words. And it just was an interesting thing, reading it. It reminded me of what you were saying, because you can't put people in you can't name them blank. You have to name them people that are currently being affected by whatever it is. So you can't say someone is poor. You can say there's someone who is struggling with limited financial resources.
Yeah.
So it almost puts everyone, and you're not supposed to call someone a felon anymore. You're supposed to say, so even as I say that, right, you're supposed to say, like, who said that? But, you're supposed to say someone, someone who is in relationship with the judicial system or something like that. It just was a funny thing, but it does actually, it just reminded me to think about, the way that we describe people and the words that we use, and sort of putting people in a perpetual state of being a, fill in the blank. And I think in some ways we do see that in Jacob's life, and we're starting this week to sort of see, a really full story of a guy who is complicated as human beings are.
Well,
right?
so maybe the last thing, and we'll just, because I know time is getting close to wrap up. So one thing about Jacob for sure is that he's, I think, the most complex character in the Bible. Because we see him from in the womb, and then we see him on his deathbed. We see him as a young man. We see him as a father. We see him get married. We see like his whole life is laid out there. You certainly don't get that with Abraham. Joseph is pretty complex.
But we see him at 17.
Right. David is pretty complex. Probably I would say David second, Joseph third, but Jacob is the fullest character, maybe. Yeah.
Don't you feel so, I don't know, I don't know if it's lucky, if it's blessed, whatever it is, but I really appreciate getting to see the sort of the development of people throughout the course of their lifetimes.
Sure.
And it's nice.
Rabbinically, I mean.
Yeah. And I mean, rabbinically, yes, and also biblically.
Yeah.
Right? To just sort of watch people grow and change and evolve, and to just see that, most of the time people don't really stay the same. Sometimes we're true to our values, but there's a growth, I think, that happens. It's beautiful.
Right, and growth, possibility, and possibility, hope. So.
Amen.
All right, so we get the sign. All right. Rabbi, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. We'll be back.
Welcome back. Jeremy, thanks for your work behind the glass there.
Chodesh Tov, everyone. Good month.